With that, we reached the end of chapter 5, and as I thought, we would reach the end of chapter 5, and so we can get into chapter 6. And again, one of the more iconic images from the book of the Revelation, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So, Revelation chapter 6, beginning in verse 1 and going to verse 8. Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the seven seals, I heard one of the four living creatures saying with a loud voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out to conquer. He went out conquering and to conquer. When the Lamb broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." And another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. When he broke the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hands. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the four living creatures say, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine." When the Lamb broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat upon it had the name Death, and Hades was following him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth, to kill with the sword, with famine, and with pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Now, it's important that we understand the breaking of the seals, the coming of the four horsemen, as part of God's plan. And that can be a challenging thought. That can be a hard thought when you think about it, because a very popular idea is that God is just love. Now, the Bible tells us that God is love, and therefore we have to conclude that God is love. But the idea that God is just love is only one part of the biblical picture of God. With that, I need to ask a break. But that's something to keep in mind as we start to look at these four horsemen of the apocalypse. God is in control. He's sitting on the throne, and He is ruling, and it's the Lamb has the plan of God. And what will happen? Now, another thing that's a very popular idea when it comes to Jesus is lovable Jesus, nice Jesus, easy to get along with Jesus. Let me ask you, you've read the Gospels, let me ask you, is Jesus a one-dimensional character? No. Jesus is a complex character. Jesus has a lot going on. The same Jesus that said, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself," that same Jesus walked into the temple and saw the temple being misused. And He made a whip, and He started to drive people out of the temple, probably whacking them with the whip. Jesus, who said, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself," is whacking people with a whip. Jesus is a complex character, and any view of Jesus or any presentation of Jesus that just has happy Jesus, that just has lovey Jesus, and doesn't take into account the fact that Jesus mentions judgment, the fact that Jesus mentions hell, the fact that Jesus mentions that not everybody who calls me Lord is going to get into heaven. That Jesus is a complex Jesus, not the simple peace, love, and dope hippie Jesus that's quite popular. You'll remember in Matthew chapter 10, verse 34, He says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." God's peace And God's ultimate goal is not simply a hippie commune piece from the 60s. That is such a weak view of God, especially when you look at God's plan throughout Israel, into the New Testament, into Jesus, and into the church. And anything that doesn't take that all into account is a watered down, very limited, very wrong view of God. When the Lamb broke the first seal. So remember that it's Jesus who's breaking these seals. These events are happening under the authority of God, under the authority of Jesus. That's a very important thing. Now we've seen the 4 living creatures. Now we're going to see the 4 horsemen. 4 and 4. Very interesting. It's not the last time that we're going to see 4. The book of the Revelation is going to mention 4 angels, 4 corners of the earth, the 4 winds, some angels of judgment still to come. Now the 4 horsemen come pretty much right out of Zechariah chapter 1 and chapter 6, right? Well, not exactly, not right out of. Like all the other things that we've seen this morning, it's the same kind of, but it's also different. The seals, breaking these seals brings these 4. And I think that the text of Revelation chapter 6 then links these 4 together. Now you'll notice that it's very similar to what's said in Ezekiel chapter 14 verses 12 through 21, sword, famine, wild beasts, and plagues. And it's not unlike what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 24, talking about there'll be wars and rumors of war, there'll be famines and persecutions and things of that nature. Now the first horseman, the white horse, this horse represents people being conquered, people being oppressed, people being enslaved. Now this fellow has a bow. That is a bow and arrow. Some interpreters, some commentators, some Christians have thought, because this guy is on a white horse, because he has a crown, and then later in the book in Revelation chapter 19 we're going to see the second coming of Christ, and he's going to be riding a white horse. They've thought that perhaps this is kind of a first capitulation of the coming of Christ, and that's something that I disagree with. There's no mention here of this rider on the white horse. There's no mention of a sword coming out of his mouth. There's no mention of his eyes. There's no mention of blood on his robe. There's no mention of a name written on him. Heaven's armies are not with this guy the way we see in Revelation chapter 19 verses 11 through 16. And therefore, I conclude that this fellow is not Christ. This guy has a crown, but the crown is given to him. And I think that that's an important thing to see, that the crown is given to him. In other words, he's not operating under his own authority. Authority has been given him. His conquering is under the authority of God. Now again, he is part of the 4. The white horse and the crown. Some people have thought that's similar enough to Jesus in chapter 19 that perhaps this is the Antichrist. The Antichrist. I'm not so sure about that. In fact, I kind of think not. And the reason I think not is because this guy, he gets all of one verse. He himself is not terribly described. He's on a white horse. He has a bow. A crown is given to him. And he goes out and conquering and to conquer. If you ever see any artwork of this guy, and he has a beard, or he has a robe, that's not in the text, is it? The text doesn't tell us anything about this guy other than he's on a white horse, other than he has a bow and he has a crown given to him, and his job is to go out conquering. There's no textual link to anybody further in the book, and therefore I'm not convinced that this is the Antichrist. I think that this guy This horseman represents the kings or rulers or powerful over the centuries that have ever conquered people, that have ever oppressed people, that have ever abused people, that have ever enslaved people. One of the areas I definitely see this would be if you want examples of the white horse. This rider of the white horse, you want examples of him in the 20th century, you need to look no further than Marxism. You need to look no further than Russia. You need to look no further than the Ukraine. You need to look no further than China and Southeast Asia and parts of Central America and South America, and see how Marxism got a body count in the 20th century well over 100 million people. There's 100 million corpses on planet Earth because of Marxism. Because Marxism oppresses. Because Marxism wants to rule. Because Marxism enslaves people. And it's scary today. It's scary today. I realize I'm getting off topic, but it's scary today to have seen what Marx's doctrine did. What Karl Marx's doctrine did throughout the 20th century, Stalin and Mao and Chavez and so forth, and the body count that they racked up in the 20th century. And today, we have a large portion of people who want to put them into a different category, want to pretend that they're not Marxist, and that somebody like a Bernie Sanders has found a benevolent way to read Karl Marx. And Bernie Sanders, is somehow going to use Karl Marx to finally bring in the utopia. And so I realize I got well off topic there, but I think if you want to see the white horse in the last century, look no further than socialism, communism, and Marxism, and you can see the white horse in the last century. Now with that, I want to suggest, by extension, perhaps this white horse is also addiction. I'm going to suggest this as it could be, not as an obvious. But I want you to think about. Addiction and how addiction conquers people. Drugs and alcohol and people's lives being conquered by this. Now, why I think this isn't explicit, but perhaps it's implicit in the text, is here shortly we are going to see people not willing to repent of their sorcery. That's the word, sorcery. Now, you might be thinking sorcery as a conjuring spells and magic potions and so forth. And yes, that's part of that word. But the word in Greek is also where we get our word pharmacy, pharmaceuticals, pharmacist, etc., etc. And it had a meaning in the Greek world of taking drugs or administering drugs. Now, I'm not condemning all drugs, obviously, in our modern world. I mean, drugs, when used properly, can be very beneficial. However, when drugs conquer somebody and ruin somebody's life, I think that we see the white horseman. The red horseman. The red horseman represents war, represents conflict, represents hatred leading to violence. And again, I want to point out that the text says, to him it was granted. It was granted to him. So like the white horseman, authority has been given to him, and that is the authority to take peace from the earth. Now, I want to ask you, since the time of Cain and Abel, has there ever been real peace on planet Earth? No, there's not been real peace on planet Earth. Before World War I, obviously, was there as much global conflict? Probably not. But has there always been war? Has there always been mankind fighting against mankind, killing each other in this? And we'll come back to that also. Now, following him would be the black horse. The black horse is famine. It's also inflation. It can also be drought and those kind of things that come with this. Now, this fellow has a pair of scales in his hand, and that would be for the measuring of the daily distribution of food. Now, we see the prices here in the book of the Revelation. we see that it says a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. Now, a denarius was a military person's daily wage. It was also very close to a field worker, a laborer. It was pretty close to a day's pay. Your day's pay goes to 1 quart of wheat, goes to your food just for 1 day. Experts who look at the price of wheat and barley in this time period in Asia Minor, because remember that the letters were written to 7 churches that existed in Asia Minor in the 1st century. This is 800% inflation. 800% inflation going on here. Now it also mentions that the wine and the oil are not to be damaged. That is the wine and oil were the luxuries. They're what the rich folk had. And the rich folk having these things, they're probably the fat cats behind the inflation. They're probably the ones making all the money off of the inflation of the wheat and the barley, which again takes me back to Marxism and socialism in the 20th century, and the fact that you had literally Ukrainians and Russians starving to death, while Stalin and those in authority living in luxury and so forth. And the same is true in Venezuela today and so forth. So again, I honestly believe if you want to see the Horsemen, a great place in the 20th century, a great place to look is everywhere Marxism went in the 20th century. Now, I think there's also a reference here for these people, those who trust in their wealth. Both the book of Proverbs and Jesus had quite a bit to say about people who trust in their wealth. The Ashen horse, that is Ashen here in the New American Standard Bible. Does anybody have any other color descriptors of this horse? Pale? Pale, yes. The word here in the Greek is green. And when in classic Greek writing, green is attached to a person or to in this case an animal, it means human sickness. Now we use that same thing today. You got off the roller coaster. Oh, you're looking a bit green. Do you need to have a seat? This is disease, this is sickness, this is plague. And what's interesting about this fellow is he actually has a name. None of the other horsemen have names, but this fellow is named Death. Now, if you think about the popular view of death personified today, who do you picture? The Grim Reaper. Yes, the Grim Reaper in his long black robe and a sickle and so forth, right? Now, death is a real thing. It's a real thing that we deal with. It's a real thing that we've dealt with throughout the centuries of human history, is it not? Death, though, as a person, death's not a person. Death is a force. Death is a thing that happens, an event that happens at the end of a person's life. Here it's being personified, and Hades is following death. That is, the grave or the place of the dead is following this rider Death. Now, Jesus has defeated these two. You'll remember back in the first vision, Jesus has the keys to both death and Hades. And these two are going to be thrown into the lake of fire. In Revelation chapter 20, verse 14, death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. That is where the beast and the false prophet and the devil are also thrown. I think what's going on here is, again, personification of an abstract. And especially since the old order is going to disappear. It's going to be done. And in the new creation, and in the new heavens, and in the new earth, there's not going to be death. And if there's not going to be death, there's not going to be a need for the place of the dead. Authority is given to these entities or to these agents. War, famine, conquering, oppression, they're not people, but here the concept of war is personified. Famine is personified. Being conquered is personified. They're given authority, that is, they work not under their own authority, but they work under the authority of the Lamb and of God. God is using these things for His own purpose. And at least two of the things that He's doing is He's purifying the church, and He is punishing the unrepentant. Now, you might think, how does that work? And is that really fair? And things like that. Now, I want to illustrate to you. There were those two fellows that were crucified, one on the right hand and one on the left hand of Jesus, and they're described as criminals. And there's nothing in the text that would lead us to think that these two weren't criminals. The text tells us they were. It doesn't seem like they were falsely accused or falsely convicted. They're both under the sentence of death. They're both nailed to crosses right next to Jesus. They're under the same punishment. The same punishment coming down upon these two individuals, and makes one unrepentant and mocking. And it makes the other one softened, and he asks Jesus to be remembered when you come into your kingdom. So with that, we see that the same thing can happen to two different people, and we can have quite different outcomes. We can have completely different outcomes of those things. And when we think about war, when we think about being conquered and enslaved and so forth, when we think about pestilence and famine, and when we think about disease and things of that nature. Now, have Christians, since the first century, have Christians been victim of all four of those things? Yes. Yes, they absolutely have. Christians have suffered through wars. They've suffered through persecutions. They've suffered through famines. They've suffered through diseases. They've suffered throughout the first century into the second century, third century, fourth century, fifth, etc., etc. You'll notice in the text that these four are given authority over a fourth of the earth. They're not given authority over a fourth of for example, in chapter 9 of people who are unrepentant, or in chapter 16 of people who blaspheme God. They're simply given authority over a fourth of the earth. Now, have non-Christians, and let's say not wicked people, suffered throughout the centuries under these four also? Absolutely they have. Absolutely they have. I again think about Marxism and communism and Vietnam, for example, and peasant farmers. Peasant farmers who were just trying to grow rice. We're just trying to grow a few animals. We're just trying to take care of their family. They weren't interested in Marxism. They weren't interested in communism and socialism. And they were caught up in the battle, in the war. They suffered not because they started the war. They suffered not because they wanted war. They suffered because they were victims of that horseman. Disease and so forth. Now, it's not everybody's. It's not the universal human experience. To a certain extent, probably a good portion of the Earth's population throughout the centuries, they've at least known what captivity was. They've at least known what war was, what famine was, what disease was. But not everybody on planet Earth over the centuries, not everybody, only a limited number of people have been killed in war, victims of famine, victims of captivity, and so forth. Now, one of the things that seems to be happening in the book is the Lamb breaks one of the seals and something happens, and it seems to be sequentially. But I want you to look at the four things that the four horsemen bring, and I want you to see that they don't happen necessarily in an order. Oftentimes they come together as kind of a package deal. And I say that not flippantly, not trying to be cavalier. You look throughout human history and you see humans suffering, and that's something to take somber. That's something to realize. That there's been quite a few victims, both Christians and non-Christians, of the four horsemen throughout the centuries and even to this day. With that, we reach the end of the presentation this morning. With that, I'd like to go ahead and open the floor for questions.